Chapter 1. Almost Doesn't Count. The florist was late, the napkins were the wrong shade of ivory, and Ryan's mother had already asked if Nolan was seeing anyone. Twice. Nolan smiled through it all. He stood by the cake table, clipboard in hand, pretending to review the checklist again. In reality, he was watching Jonathan across the room, laughing with Ryan's uncle near the fireplace. His suit was charcoal with a navy tie, classic, crisp, perfect. His hand rested on Ryan's back like it belonged there. It shouldn't hurt anymore. "You're frowning again," Ryan said, nudging him in the side. "You always do that when you're stressed. Or hungry. Want me to sneak you a cupcake?" Nolan startled, clearing his throat. "I'm fine. Just making sure the caterer got your nut-free thing right." Ryan smiled like Nolan had personally ensured his safety for the next decade. "You're the best. Seriously. I don't know what I'd do without you." Nolan smiled back. He'd learned how to, by now. The hall was decorated in soft gold and ivory, fairy lights strung from the beams, a live jazz trio setting the mood. It was warm, romantic, effortless, the kind of party Ryan deserved, the kind of night that should have felt like a celebration. But all Nolan could see was the man standing in the center of it. Jonathan. It hadn't always been like this. Once, it had been easy, late-night coffee runs during Ryan's summer internships. Movie marathons when Jonathan would join them halfway through with a box of donuts and no intention of leaving. Then came Nolan's heartbreak, his worst breakup, the one that left him curled in Jonathan's passenger seat, eyes swollen and lips trembling. "He said I was too much," Nolan had whispered, head against the window. Jonathan hadn't spoken right away. He'd just let the silence stretch between them like a warm coat. Then gently he'd reached over, fingers brushing Nolan's knee. "You're not too much," he'd said. "He just wasn't enough." Nolan had turned to him then, throat tight, and Jonathan's eyes had lingered on his mouth. Just a second too long. That had been the first, almost. Almost a kiss. Almost a confession. Almost the moment that changed everything. But Jonathan had looked away, jaw tightening, and Nolan had told himself it didn't mean anything. And then, 6 months later, Jonathan was dating Ryan. "Can you fix your tie already?" Ryan's voice brought Nolan back to the present. "It's crooked, and I refuse to have you look like a disheveled art gremlin in the photos." Nolan rolled his eyes but fumbled with the tie anyway. His fingers were clumsy, shaky. "Here," another voice said, low and smooth and unmistakable. "Let me." "Jonathan." He stepped in close, careful, taking the fabric from Nolan's hands with infuriating ease. His fingers brushed Nolan's collarbone, a feather-light touch, but it sent a wave of heat crashing through Nolan's spine. Nolan didn't dare breathe. Jonathan didn't look at him, not really, but there was a tightness around his mouth, a flicker in his eyes as he focused on the knot. "There," he said softly, stepping back. "Perfect." "Thanks," Nolan murmured. Ryan reappeared seconds later, oblivious. "Okay, team. Guests are here. Cue the happy couple poses." Nolan moved like he was supposed to, standing beside Ryan for the speeches, ushering in guests, smiling for photos. But his eyes kept finding Jonathan across the room, and every time they did, it felt like he was drowning quietly behind his own smile. He caught Jonathan watching him once, just once, over someone's shoulder. His gaze wasn't romantic, wasn't tender. It was tortured, and Nolan hated that it made him feel seen. The engagement toast went off without a hitch. Ryan's mother cried. Jonathan gave a charming, polished speech. Nolan clapped. He didn't remember any of it. The party bled into golden hour, drinks flowing, laughter echoing. And then, Jonathan's hand around Ryan's waist, Ryan leaning in, their lips touching. Nolan turned away before it could register fully, stomach clenched, vision blurry. He walked out to the balcony and gripped the railing until his knuckles turned white. The wind was cool against his face. It steadied him, reminded him to keep breathing. He was still standing there 10 minutes later when the door slid open behind him. "I figured I'd find you out here," Jonathan said. Nolan didn't turn. "Shouldn't you be inside, celebrating your almost marriage?" Jonathan stepped beside him, leaving a respectful gap between them. His voice was quieter now, rougher. "You looked like you couldn't breathe." "I'm fine." "I know you're not." Nolan finally turned, meeting his eyes. Jonathan's expression was unreadable, but his gaze flicked to Nolan's mouth again. It always did. Like muscle memory. Like regret. "Why did you come out here?" Nolan asked. Jonathan's jaw twitched. "Because I couldn't let you stand here alone." Nolan laughed, but it cracked halfway through. You let me do that every day. That landed like a bruise. They stood in silence, the party still glowing inside, the music a muffled hum. Then Jonathan reached out and touched Nolan's wrist, just a brush of fingers. Nothing more. But it was too much, too kind, too intimate. Nolan flinched like it burned. Don't, he whispered. Jonathan pulled back, hands sinking into his pockets. I'm sorry. No, Nolan said. You're not, and that's the problem. Jonathan looked at him, eyes suddenly glassy, like he might say something dangerous, but instead he just whispered, I wish things were different. Nolan looked away. So do I. Inside, the party moved on. Ryan danced with his cousins. Nolan waved off a coworker trying to set him up with someone. He watched Jonathan smile for photos like nothing inside him was breaking. But later, as the night wound down and Nolan helped box leftover cake and fold tablecloths, he caught Jonathan staring at him again, just for a moment. Nolan didn't smile back. He couldn't, because he knew. Jonathan knew. He always had. And the worst part wasn't that Nolan had fallen in love. It was that he'd been seen, wanted, almost, and still left behind. Chapter 2. The Weight of Almost. The invitation shimmered with gold foil, tucked between pages of wedding brochures and fabric swatches on Ryan's kitchen table. Nolan tried not to look at it too long. It felt like staring at a wound. So, Ryan said, pouring wine with a bright smile, I know this is a little unorthodox, but I wanted to ask before we start calling people. Nolan tilted his head, cautious. Ask what? Ryan slid a box across the table. A sleek black one tied with a pale ribbon. Inside was a gold-stitched handkerchief, a small lapel pin shaped like a paintbrush, and a note written in Ryan's looping script. Will you be my man of honor? Nolan blinked once. Then again. Ryan was beaming. You've been with me through every breakup, every disaster date, every night I cried over pasta. You're my family. Who else would I want standing next to me? Nolan's throat burned. Ryan? Ryan waved him off. Don't argue. You're doing it. I already ordered you a custom suit. It's navy. You'll look like an emotionally tortured oil painting. Nolan laughed. It came out strangled. He said yes. Of course, he said yes. And across the apartment from the kitchen doorway, Jonathan watched the whole thing. Silent, unreadable, eyes on Nolan like he couldn't look away. After that, Nolan started pulling away. He told Ryan he was busy with lesson planning. Told Jonathan nothing at all. Instead, he poured himself into his art, into his students, into the painting that had haunted the edges of his mind for years. It started with a silhouette. Broad shoulders, head bowed. A man turned slightly away, unreachable. Every brushstroke carved out longing. Every shade of blue bled like a bruise. He titled it Unspoken. When the local gallery announced a spring showcase for new artists, Nolan submitted it without telling anyone. Mr. Hale, one of his students chirped, poking her head into the art room. There's a tall guy outside with good hair asking for you. Nolan looked up from the project table. Good hair? She shrugged. I'd say fiancé level hair. Nolan's stomach dropped. Jonathan stood in the hallway with a clipboard and a sheepish smile. He wore a gray peacoat and carried a wedding binder tucked beneath his arm like a bomb. I come bearing lists, he said. Nolan crossed his arms. Ryan couldn't make it? He got stuck on a call, told me to drop these off and drag you through centerpieces. I don't pick flowers. Ryan thinks you do. Nolan hesitated. I have class soon. Jonathan's grin twitched. Then I guess we better be quick. They ducked into the supply room. It was narrow and packed with canvas rolls, old easels, and boxes of student work. Nolan reached for the light, but the bulb sputtered and dimmed to a flicker. Jonathan laughed under his breath. Romantic. Shut up, Nolan muttered. They both moved at once, reaching for the same folder on the shelf. Nolan's hand brushed Jonathan's. They froze. Jonathan didn't pull away. Nolan stepped back quickly, breath shallow. The door clicked behind them. Nolan turned. It was locked. You've got to be kidding me, he whispered. Jonathan tried the knob. Well, this is cliché. They stood in awkward silence, pressed by walls that suddenly felt too close. Jonathan leaned against a cabinet, arms crossed. You haven't answered any of my texts. I've been busy. That's not why. Nolan looked away. Jonathan's voice softened. You always disappear when it gets too real. Nolan scoffed. You're one to talk. You're getting married and you're still here, alone. Jonathan's jaw tightened. You make it sound like I planned this. You didn't have to. The air was heavy, dense with things neither of them should say. Finally, Jonathan whispered, "You make me feel like a different version of myself." Nolan met his gaze. "Then maybe you're marrying the wrong person." Jonathan blinked, and in that breath, something cracked open. He took a step forward. Nolan didn't move. But just as Jonathan opened his mouth, just as the room shifted on its axis, the door opened. Ryan stood in the doorway, holding a ring sample kit. He took one look at them, too close, too quiet, and smiled tightly. "Found the rings?" he said. "Ready?" Jonathan nodded. His voice didn't come out. Nolan stepped away first. The silence followed them out. That afternoon, Ryan stopped by the flower shop on Oak Ridge. He needed ideas for the reception centerpieces, something elegant but not stiff. He didn't expect the shop to smell so strongly of lavender and peppermint. Avery was behind the counter, arranging soft white peonies into a glass vase. Tattoos peeked from under his rolled sleeves, delicate vines, tiny stars. "You're Ryan, right?" Avery asked, not missing a beat. Ryan blinked. "Yeah. You know Nolan?" "We've talked. He likes the violets I keep out back. Doesn't talk much, though. Just lingers." Ryan smiled faintly. "That sounds like him." Avery stepped out from behind the counter and handed Ryan a wrapped bouquet. "You look like you could use something soft today." Ryan raised a brow. "Is it that obvious?" Avery didn't answer right away, just tilted his head. "Are you always this good at pretending to be fine?" Ryan's throat tightened. "I don't think anyone's ever asked me that," he said softly. Avery just smiled. "Well, now someone has." Nolan stayed late at school that night, cleaning brushes, sorting portfolios, but mostly hiding. He couldn't stop thinking about Jonathan's words in the supply closet, the way they hadn't touched, but still left the air between them singed. He wanted it to mean nothing, but it meant everything. When he got home, a notification buzzed on his phone. "Congratulations, Unspoken has been selected for the Spring Artist Showcase." He stared at it for a long time. The painting, the gallery, the chance to be seen not for the things he couldn't say, but for what he could. A tear slipped down his cheek before he even realized it. He wiped it away, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. But even in that fragile joy, a thought lingered. He hadn't painted Jonathan's smile, just his silhouette, because Nolan had never really had the whole of him. Only shadows, only almosts. Chapter 3. The Confession. The suit was too tight, or maybe it was the room. Nolan stood frozen in front of the mirror at the bridal boutique, arms half raised, a measuring tape draped around his neck like a noose. The tailor was speaking, but he couldn't hear her. Everything had gone muffled. His reflection shimmered in and out of focus. His face pale, lips parted, chest rising and falling too fast. The color of the tie matched the invitations. Pale gold, Ryan's choice. Nolan's hands trembled as he tried to adjust it, but his fingers felt numb. The tailor tapped his shoulder. "Sir, are you—" "I need a minute," Nolan said, voice hoarse. He stumbled out of the fitting area, nearly colliding with a mannequin, and ducked into the small dressing room near the back. The door clicked shut behind him, and he collapsed onto the cushioned bench, hands over his face. His lungs wouldn't work right. His vision blurred at the edges. Get it together. Just breathe. But he couldn't. Not when everything in him was screaming, "You can't watch him marry someone else." The door creaked open. Nolan barely noticed until he felt someone kneel in front of him. "Nolan." Jonathan's voice. Nolan jerked his hands down, but his face was already wet. He didn't even remember starting to cry. Jonathan looked stricken. Hey, look at me." Nolan shook his head. "I'm fine. I just need air." Jonathan didn't leave. He reached forward, hands gentle, resting lightly on Nolan's shaking fingers. "You don't have to do this," Jonathan said softly. Nolan laughed. Bitter, broken. "This? What? Be the supportive best friend to the man marrying the guy I've been in love with for half a decade?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "I know." The air between them turned sharp. Nolan's voice cracked. "I can't keep pretending I'm okay watching you promise your life to someone else. I can't keep standing beside you like I'm not screaming inside." Jonathan's face crumpled. He lifted a hand, slow, hesitant, and brushed a tear from Nolan's cheek. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I didn't know what to do. You were—" "Off limits," Nolan whispered. Jonathan didn't answer. He leaned in slowly, deliberately, like crossing a line he'd held back from too long. Their foreheads brushed. Nolan's breath hitched. And then— a kiss. Not a real one. Not quite. just the softest press of lips to the corner of Nolan's mouth. It was barely anything, but it lit something in Nolan's chest like wildfire. And then the door opened. Ryan stood in the doorway. He didn't speak, didn't yell, didn't even blink. His eyes moved from Jonathan to Nolan and back again. Then he turned and walked away, so quietly the door didn't even click shut behind him. Jonathan surged to his feet, guilt slamming into his features. Ryan, but he was already gone. Nolan didn't move. He just sat there, tie askew, heart pounding like it wanted out of his ribs. He didn't paint that night. He couldn't. Instead, he took Unspoken down from his wall and set it on the floor. He stared at it for a long time, fingers twitching. Then, with shaking hands, he picked up a brush and painted over the silhouette. Stroke by stroke, he erased Jonathan from the canvas. Tears dripped onto the wet paint. He didn't stop. Even when he collapsed into the corner of the shower hours later, water scalding the sobs racking his body, he didn't stop seeing the way Jonathan had looked at him. Not like a friend. Not like a mistake. But like a man who had just realized too late that the thing he wanted had been within reach all along. It was past midnight when the knock came. Nolan didn't answer at first. Then another knock. Softer. "Nolan." "It's me." Jonathan's voice was low, tired. Nolan opened the door. Jonathan stood there, coat unbuttoned, hair mussed from running his hands through it too many times. He held nothing. Just himself. "I'm not here for a scene," he said. I need to talk." Nolan stepped aside. The apartment was dark, save for a lamp by the couch, the half-finished wine bottle on the table, the ruined painting leaning against the wall. Jonathan didn't comment on any of it. They sat down. Not close, not far, just there. "I didn't plan that," Jonathan said. "The kiss, the moment, I know." Jonathan turned toward him. "I keep thinking about that night in the car. When you cried, I wanted to kiss you then. So badly, but you were hurt, and I was scared." Nolan swallowed hard. "You should have told me. I didn't know how, and then I was with Ryan, and it felt easier, simpler." "Did you love him?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. "I loved that he didn't make things complicated," he said finally, "but I never looked at him the way I look at you." Silence settled like fog. Nolan leaned back against the couch, eyes stinging. "It would have been easier if I hated you." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "But then I wouldn't have spent the last 3 years wondering how it would have felt if you ever loved me back." The words landed between them like a wound. They didn't kiss again. They didn't touch. They just lay down on the couch, side by side, not touching. Not needing to. The intimacy was in the stillness. Nolan closed his eyes. Jonathan watched him. "I never wanted to hurt you," Jonathan whispered. Nolan didn't respond, but for the first time in weeks he fell asleep with someone beside him. Not a shadow, not a secret. Just Jonathan. Still here. Even if only for now. Chapter 4, The One Who Stayed. The knock on Nolan's door came just after dawn. He didn't answer. His phone had been off for 2 days. He'd left the gallery message unread. The ruined painting remained face down against the wall, the last remnant of what he once thought he could handle, loving Jonathan in silence. He hadn't expected Ryan. "Nolan," the voice said, soft, uncertain. "I know you're in there." Nolan stood frozen by the window, bare feet on cool tile, staring out at a sky still washed in pale orange. He didn't move. Another knock. "I'm not here to scream," Ryan added. "I'm not even here to ask why." When Nolan opened the door, Ryan stood there in joggers and a hoodie, hair rumpled, eyes red. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ryan stepped inside, hands in his pockets, like he'd done 100 times before. But everything was different now. "I saw it," Ryan said, voice low. "At the fitting." Nolan didn't deny it. Ryan sat on the edge of the couch. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve. "I saw the way he looked at you years ago. I just hoped I was wrong." Nolan sat too, a safe distance away. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "I know." Ryan gave a breathless, broken laugh. "That's the worst part. You didn't seduce him. You didn't chase him. You just existed, and he kept choosing to look at you." Silence. Ryan's eyes shone now, but not with rage, just tired grief. "I wanted someone who looked at me the way he already looked at you," he said. Nolan swallowed hard. But Ryan leaned over and hugged him. Nolan froze. Then slowly pressed his face into his best friend's shoulder. "You're not the villain," Ryan murmured. "You just didn't know how to stop." The hug lingered. They didn't cry. Not really. It wasn't that kind of pain. It was older. Deeper. like scar tissue being cut open again just to let it heal properly this time. When they pulled apart, Ryan stood, a new resolve settling in his posture. "I'm leaving him," he said. "I'm not doing this to punish either of you. I deserve more than being someone's second best." Nolan didn't try to argue. "I'll be at my cousin's place," Ryan added. "Tell him I said goodbye if you see him first." 3 days passed before Nolan surfaced. He took a backpack, a journal, and a hoodie that still smelled faintly like the old beach house they used to visit in college. He drove without thinking until the air grew salty and the road curved toward the sea. The beach was nearly empty. He kicked off his shoes and walked until the waves kissed his ankles. Then, kneeling in the wet sand, he picked up a piece of driftwood and started writing. The name stretched in uneven lines, the tide already creeping toward it. He watched it until it blurred. Then he sat down, pulled his knees to his chest, and let the wind scream where he couldn't. Jonathan didn't sleep. He called, texted, went to Nolan's apartment, waited on the porch until the sun dipped below the buildings and the air grew cold. Still nothing. On the fourth morning, he drove to Nolan's school, hoping to catch him between classes. The receptionist said Nolan had taken a personal leave. Something about needing air. She offered sympathetically. Desperate, Jonathan wandered into the art room. It was quiet. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, catching dust in lazy spirals. Easels stood like forgotten soldiers, and half-finished student work lined the back shelves. And then he saw them. Paintings. Dozens of them. All of him. Jonathan stood frozen as he took them in. His silhouette, his eyes, his hands, his back turned, his face in profile, some abstract, some painfully clear. All of them aching with something raw and intimate. He stepped closer to one canvas that hadn't been completed, a splash of charcoal and blue, his figure dissolving into shadow. Unspoken, he realized. All this time, all these years. He sat on the nearest stool, head in his hands. He'd loved Nolan too, but he'd been too much of a coward to say it when it mattered. Now maybe it was already too late. Meanwhile, Ryan found himself at the only open flower shop in town at 11:42 p.m., staring at a wilted bucket of daisies under flickering lights. "Bit of a sad choice," a voice said behind him. He turned. Avery. The florist wore a soft maroon sweater, sleeves pushed up, an apron dusted with green and glitter. He looked like someone who belonged in a better story than this. Ryan gave a weak smile. "They were my mom's favorite. I guess I just needed something." Avery walked around the counter, knelt by the daisies, then stood and handed Ryan a small bouquet of lavender instead. "Try these. They don't scream grief." Ryan took them carefully, inhaled. Something loosened in his chest. "Thanks." Avery smiled. "You look like someone who hasn't laughed in weeks. That obvious?" "I have a talent for spotting the people trying too hard to seem fine." Ryan laughed under his breath. Avery gestured to the curb outside. "Come on. I've got leftover Rocky Road and 2 spoons." They sat on the curb under a sleepy street lamp, eating straight from the tub, legs stretched toward the gutter like teenagers skipping prom. "I was going to marry someone who never really saw me," Ryan said, halfway through the container. "And I think I knew it. But I didn't want to be alone again." Avery didn't speak, just passed him the spoon. "You ever do something like that?" Ryan asked. "I once dated a guy who only kissed me in the dark," Avery said, calmly. "Took me a year to realize I wasn't a secret, I was just convenient." Ryan winced. "Ouch." "Yeah," Avery smirked. "But now I run a flower shop, eat ice cream with strangers, and know I'm not for hiding anymore." Ryan looked at him for a long time. Then, without warning, he laughed. Really laughed. It caught him by surprise, but it felt real, like the first deep breath after being underwater too long. "Thanks," he said, voice rough. Avery just nodded. "You don't owe me anything, but if you ever need more flowers, or ice cream, or just someone who doesn't expect you to smile all the time." "I'll come here," Ryan said, grinning now. They sat in companionable silence until the tub was empty and the stars were starting to disappear. Jonathan finally found Nolan sitting on the edge of a wooden boardwalk 3 towns down the coast. He'd left his number with enough gas station attendants and gallery owners to track him to the tiny Airbnb near the dunes. Nolan didn't look surprised when he approached. "You found me." Jonathan sat beside him. Close. Not touching. "I saw the classroom." Nolan looked at the ocean. Jonathan added, "You could have told me." You wouldn't have stayed, Nolan said. Not then. Jonathan hesitated. Maybe not, but I would have looked back. Nolan smiled, small and tired. You always did. They didn't speak again for a while. Just watched the water chase itself in and out of the shore. Nolan's voice was quiet when he finally said he didn't deserve to be hurt. I know. You didn't mean for any of this. I know that too. Jonathan turned to him. But I stayed, and so did you. And maybe that has to mean something. Nolan didn't answer, but this time he didn't walk away. Chapter 5. What Love Feels Like. Ryan never thought he'd be the kind of person who found peace in a flower shop. But there was something about Avery's place, always smelling of lavender and rosemary, classical music humming under the rustle of leaves, that slowed the world down. The chaos didn't follow him inside. Neither did the guilt. He'd started visiting in the early evenings, at first under the guise of needing arrangements for events he wasn't hosting. Avery never called him out, just smiled, handed him tea, and let him talk if he wanted, or sit silently if he didn't. Today they were repotting succulents on the sidewalk. Avery wore gardening gloves and had smudges of soil on his cheek. Ryan handed him ceramic pots from a nearby box, one of them, a bright yellow one, painted with childlike flowers and the words, "Try again tomorrow," in shaky brushstrokes. You made this one? Avery asked, turning it over in his hands. Ryan nodded. I know I'm no artist. No, but you are honest. That counts more. Ryan swallowed hard. He hadn't cried since the night he left Jonathan. He'd told himself he didn't need to, that he wasn't allowed to, since he hadn't been the one cheated on. But now, watching Avery gently fill a pot with soil, offering space without pity, it cracked something open. I was never enough, Ryan said, voice small. I was safe, convenient, easy to be with. Avery set the pot down and turned to him, eyes soft. You were someone's safe place. That's not nothing. Ryan shook his head. But it wasn't love, not really. He looked down at his hands. His voice trembled when he whispered, No one ever waited for me to be ready before. Avery stepped closer. No dramatics, no sweeping music. He just wrapped his arms around Ryan, held him close as the sunset dipped behind the awning, and Ryan let go. Let it all fall from his shoulders, the pretending, the expectations, the guilt. And in that quiet, soft embrace, for the first time in weeks, he breathed like it didn't hurt. A week later, Ryan showed up at the Saturday farmer's market with a hand-painted flower pot tucked under his arm. It was simple. Cream background, a tiny lavender sprig sketched in the center, and a handwritten label on the bottom. Not perfect, but mine. Avery blinked down at it. Then, you painted this? I mean, barely. Ryan laughed. It took 3 tries to make the stem look like a stem. Avery traced the curve of the sprig with his finger, smiling. Do you like it? Ryan asked. I love it, Avery said simply. They stood there for a beat, heartbeats slow, the scent of peaches and rosemary drifting between them. Then Avery reached out and took Ryan's hand, gentle and sure. And in the middle of a crowded market, with strangers bustling by and sunshine warming the back of his neck, Ryan leaned in and kissed him. It was soft, sweet, not urgent, not desperate, but real, and it felt like beginning again. The gallery was nearly empty when Jonathan arrived. Late afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, catching the gold leaf on the display plaques. He'd been here before, months ago, when Nolan had painted other people, other faces. But now the center wall was dominated by a single piece, unspoken, restored, bold, raw. Jonathan stared at it, breath caught in his throat. Nolan hadn't just repainted it. He had finished it. Where the shadow had once blurred into absence, there was now clarity. The silhouette, Jonathan's silhouette, stood illuminated by a golden background, head turned slightly, mouth parted as if about to speak. It wasn't sorrowful. It was open, vulnerable. Jonathan didn't realize Nolan had entered the gallery until he heard his voice behind him. You always came too late. Jonathan turned slowly. Nolan stood there in a loose black shirt, paint smudged on his wrist, expression unreadable. I didn't know what to say, Jonathan said. You always did, Nolan replied. You just never said it. Jonathan stepped closer. I tried to do the right thing. I really did. I thought staying with Ryan, honoring my commitment, it mattered more than what I felt. He paused, but the only thing that ever felt right was you. Nolan didn't speak, but his eyes glistened. Jonathan's voice cracked. I'm not asking you to forget the hurt, or to pretend this wasn't a mess, but I want to start over. No lies, no secrets, just us. Nolan stepped forward, just one step. His hand brushed Jonathan's, and then he broke. They collided like gravity pulling planets back into alignment. Desperate, messy, real. Nolan's hands gripped Jonathan's shirt. Jonathan cradled Nolan's face like something fragile and precious. Their lips met in a kiss that wasn't delicate. It was years of silence unspooling. Regret turning into need. A breathless gasp between them as Nolan pulled him closer, clung to him like he'd waited a lifetime to be touched without shame. "I'm still angry," Nolan whispered against Jonathan's mouth. "I know, but I'm tired of being angry more than I'm tired of loving you." Jonathan pressed his forehead to Nolan's. "Then let me make it right." Nolan nodded. And they didn't stop. Not this time. They stumbled into Nolan's apartment with hands on skin and mouths chasing each other between laughter and sobs. It wasn't rushed. It was unspoken promises, whispered apologies, the slow ache of desire tempered by reverence. Clothes were shed like burdens. Touch was rediscovery. And when Nolan lay back, breathless, Jonathan traced the edge of his collarbone like a prayer. Nolan looked up at him, eyes wide and shining. "I don't want to be a secret anymore." "You're not," Jonathan said, voice raw. "Not now. Not ever again." The world blurred. Time softened, and in the quiet dark, wrapped around each other like something sacred, they finally became what they'd always almost been. The next morning, Nolan woke with sunlight on his bare shoulder, and Jonathan's hand splayed against his chest. He turned slightly, brushing hair out of Jonathan's eyes. Jonathan stirred, but didn't wake. Nolan watched him for a while, not because he needed confirmation, but because he finally believed it was real. No almosts, no secrets, just the one who stayed. Chapter 6. We Were Never a Mistake. The wedding was called off on a Sunday morning. Ryan announced it over coffee at his parents' house in the same kitchen where he'd once showed off ring photos and centerpiece samples. The silence after his words stretched like the moment between lightning and thunder. His mother blinked. You mean postponed?" Ryan shook his head. "No, Mom. Canceled. It's over." "But, sweetheart, we're all just trying to love the best way we can." Ryan said softly, "Sometimes it doesn't look like forever. Sometimes it looks like letting go." No one yelled. No one wept. His father nodded once, slowly. His mother reached for his hand. No dramatic collapse, just a quiet acceptance, and in that, something almost like relief. Because deep down, they'd seen it too. Jonathan hadn't been the forever. Just the comfort. And Ryan was ready to stop mistaking one for the other. Weeks later, spring bloomed like forgiveness. At the local art fair, Nolan stood beside Jonathan under a striped awning, laughing at the crooked price sign on his table. "You misspelled expressionism," he teased. Jonathan, looking unbothered in a rolled-up button-down and sunglasses, shrugged. "You try writing with that chalkboard pen. It's sabotage." Their hands were linked beneath the table, fingers tangled lazily. It had taken time. Not all the stares had been kind. But Nolan didn't flinch anymore when Jonathan reached for him in public. He didn't look over his shoulder for disapproval. He just held on tighter. One of the centerpieces on the table was a new painting, smaller than Unspoken, but radiant in color. Jonathan again, this time turned fully toward the viewer, smiling, bright eyes squinting like he'd just been caught laughing in the sun. Nolan hadn't painted sadness into him this time. He hadn't needed to. A few blocks down, nestled between a bakery and a used bookstore, a new boutique opened quietly with a hand-painted sign above the door, Still in Bloom. Inside, flowers filled the left wall, seasonal bundles, lavender bundles tied with twine, golden sunflowers leaning toward the windows. On the right, framed photographs lined rustic shelves, laughing couples, tender hands, blurred kisses in golden hour light. Avery handled the flowers. Ryan took the pictures. They made a strange team at first. Avery had quiet rhythms and long silences. Ryan talked too much when nervous and once knocked over an entire shelf of mason jars trying to hang fairy lights. But they fit. Ryan found that he liked closing the shop to the sound of Avery humming off-key. He liked finding wild daisies tucked into his pockets when he wasn't looking. And he especially liked that when he panicked about whether he was moving too fast or not fast enough, Avery always answered the same way. "Then let's just stand still together." When the invitation to Lucas's birthday party came, Nolan hesitated. "He's still friends with Ryan," he said, looking at the card. So are we, Jonathan reminded him. That night they arrived together, hand in hand, the way they had at the fair, only this time Nolan wore one of Jonathan's old denim jackets, and Jonathan had paint on his forearm he hadn't bothered to wash off. The backyard was filled with familiar faces. Old mutual friends, co-workers, even a few distant cousins. Music floated from a speaker propped on the porch railing. Someone had strung fairy lights across the trees. Ryan was already there, laughing with Lucas near the grill, a flower pin clipped to the collar of his shirt, and beside him, Avery. Nolan's breath caught. Ryan caught sight of them first. For a second, Nolan braced himself, for bitterness, for awkwardness, for the kind of cold civility that came from relationships that ended with loose threads. Instead, Ryan smiled, genuinely. He walked up to them with 2 drinks in hand, passed one to Jonathan, and said, "You've got something on your ear." Jonathan reached up, confused, only to find a smudge of paint. Nolan laughed. "That's probably mine." Ryan glanced between them, still smiling. "You both look lighter." "We are," Nolan said quietly. Ryan nodded. Then turned as Avery approached, handing him a cookie he'd snuck from the kitchen. Avery leaned in and kissed Ryan's cheek. Quick, affectionate, utterly natural. Nolan watched the way Ryan leaned into it like muscle memory, the way his eyes softened. There was no tension in his shoulders, no cracks to pretend away. Jonathan slid his arm around Nolan's waist, pulling him in. "You okay?" he murmured. "Better than okay," Nolan whispered. "For the first time, maybe ever." The 4 of them stood near the back fence, sipping drinks and telling stories, and no one mentioned the past. Not because it was forgotten, but because it didn't need to be retold. That night, the apartment was quiet, the windows cracked open to let in the spring breeze. Nolan lay in bed, chest bare, comforter tangled around his legs. Jonathan traced slow, lazy circles on his shoulder. The moon spilled silver across the sheets. Nolan turned, voice low and hesitant. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing me?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to Nolan's shoulder, his hand tightening just slightly on his waist. "Every time I see you look at me like that," he whispered, "I know I never had a choice." Nolan blinked. "That sounds like something out of one of my sad paintings. Then maybe I like being your muse." Nolan rolled his eyes, but he was smiling when Jonathan kissed him again, slow and unhurried, a promise and a confession all at once. They didn't speak again after that. They didn't need to. They fell asleep tangled together, hearts steady, breath synced. No fear, no more hiding, just truth and time and tenderness. Across town, the flower shop glowed under warm lights. Petals littered the floor. Avery had knocked over a crate of hydrangeas, and Ryan had started a one-man cleanup mission before giving up and collapsing onto the rug with a handful of daisies in his lap. "You are," Avery said from behind the counter, "the worst assistant florist this city has ever seen." Ryan held up a petal in protest. "I'm giving this daisy a second life." Avery tossed him a damp towel. "You're giving me extra hours of sweeping." Ryan sat up, laughing. The sound echoed softly through the space. Avery walked over, knelt beside him, and brushed a petal from Ryan's hair. "This is what love's supposed to feel like," Ryan murmured, looking up at him. Avery smiled, fingers running gently through Ryan's hair. "Then let's keep growing it." And they did. Every day, every hour, every quiet second between the noise of the world. Because not all love starts loud. Some love grows from what's left behind, from what survives, from what stays.